Pop quiz, but it's okay, it's open book. The final paragraph of the Aleinu. What's it about? The Alkain paragraph. You've heard me daven that out loud a few times. No, not this evening, or this afternoon, I guess, technically. But of course, remember, if we're not davening it out loud, that means you're still reciting it privately to yourself in the language of your greatest comprehension and meaning, right? Yes, of course, Rabbi, of course. All those times where I say, please continue privately or please continue at your own pace, you're actually continuing. So let's, like I said, it's a pop quiz. We were just on that page. Al Kei Nekaveh. What are we hoping for here? What is the final paragraph? Just give me the summary.
We're hoping that everybody in the world will realize that God is God.
We will hope that everyone in the world, and we call out a few of the rascals of idolatry and the mental traps of such worship, that should be swept away from the world, and that everyone will come to Adonai, and not just recognize God as God, but in the language of Zechariah, which is the very famous ending, the V'nehemar v'haya, all right, that line, that the entire world will recognize God as one, and that God will be the king, the ruler, the sovereign, the monarch, whichever word you prefer, over the entirety of the world. Right? I just want to make sure we're all on that same page. We're good? Exactly. Why did this whole Aleinu, with this in mind, migrate? Because the Aleinu did not originally appear at the end of Shabbat Mincha, or at the end of a weekday Maariv service, or at the end of a regular Shacharit service. Aleinu used to show up like one time a year, the high holidays. Aleinu was written for the Malchuyot service that we recited earlier this morning. Actually, it may have technically been afternoon when we got there. When we do the V'ishtachavu in real form by laying out on the ground, that is where Aleinu was originally crafted. And it was crafted many, many centuries ago. Different estimates abound, anywhere from in the year 200 of the Common Era, or perhaps even earlier than that. It is indeed a very, very ancient prayer and ancient construction. But it used to be reserved for just those few moments during the year when Aleinu was recited during the Yamim Noraim, these days of awe. And yet, in Europe, it migrated. It multiplied, much like fishes and loaves. It spread to every service. So now it is the custom in any Ashkenazic service to always have Aleinu at the end, at the conclusion of the service. Any hypotheses of why that might have happened?
So, Rabbi, this is the beginning of establishing the world sovereignty of the Almighty. Beginning in the 19th century, this phrase came to be seen as similar to what they call to be elected to the nation. The interpreters call it the justice. Cheating instead of the book.
So indeed, in the 1800s, during the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment of Europe, and then onwards into the 20th century, it very much became a call to social justice, a light unto the nations, that evil would be swept from the face of the earth by the light of Torah, and that we were the torchbearers of that light. But the transition of Aleinu from a high holiday prayer to being an everyday prayer happened long before that particular change. So while I definitely do not disagree with the editors of Lev Shalem, that wasn't the birth of the transition.
The idols are profound. They're everywhere, and they actually grew in number.
They are everywhere, they grew in number, and they seem to be getting worse. Those of you that are students of Jewish history, even on a very superficial level, will recognize, of course, that following the First Crusade, as I mentioned earlier this morning, things got worse. And the power of the Catholic Church in particular became more and more ascendant. And the accoutrement of the Catholic Church as it was being promulgated at that time Well, with the proliferation of statues of saints and of the Holy Family and such, it did indeed feel somewhat idolatrous to us, but more importantly, the behavior of those potentates that were standing as bishops began to feel very familiar to the idolatrous nations of the world past. And so in Europe, they decided to integrate the blessing of Aleinu into everyday prayer as a way of thumbing our nose at what we were seeing as the rising tyranny of the pseudo-idolatrous practice within the power structure of Christian Europe. And for hundreds of years, that was very much proved right until eventually changes within the European mindset began to undo what even the Europeans began to see as being the excesses of that mindset, and began to drift away from the cathedrals and the trappings of power that had become the norm for those people. But you'll notice something. I seem to be focused entirely on just one part of the Jewish world. What about the Mizrahi? What about the Jews who lived in the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa under Muslim rule? They did not adapt Aleinu into their everyday prayer. It's one of the major differences between the Sephardic liturgy and the Ashkenazic liturgy is we seem to be Aleinu crazy, and they don't seem to have caught the fever of having Aleinu everywhere. But then remember, they had a very different experience during this transformative phase. While we were finding our rights and freedoms taken away from us quite rapidly in many places, as we suffered expulsion after expulsion in almost clockwork fashion in Europe, our brothers and sisters who lived under Muslim rule, by and large, did not have the same experience. Don't get me wrong, they were still second-class citizens, but everybody expected that when you weren't part of the elite. But the religion that was being promulgated did not have big statues. Islam is very famously opposed to idolatrous forms as much as we are. To statues and images, they find to be a deep offense against their conception of God. And so we found some common ground there. And many of the underlying theological points, lacking the Trinity, obviously, we also found greater common ground. We did not see them as being as aggressive, as antagonistic, as hateful towards the ideas of Torah that we were trying to promote, and which in Christian Europe during the Middle Ages seemed to be the antithesis of everything that we stood for. And so there was no cause to introduce Aleinu into a constant repetition throughout the services. Everybody following the logic here? What does this mean? What this means is that our liturgy reflects the needs that we have witnessed in the world around us. Now, sometimes that happens through fundamental radical shifts, such as producing Aleinu constantly throughout our services because of the constant threat and pressures that our ancestors felt. Sometimes this happens more subtly, the introduction of more mystical elements in the Kabbalat Shabbat service, coming along after the expulsion of Spain and the proliferation of Kabbalistic thinking, which I mentioned again in my sermon earlier today. But sometimes it happens more subtly, with more personal reflection and introspection, where the words of a prayer may have meant something in a context 1,000, 2,000 years ago, but can mean something different to us today. As John already pointed out from the editor's comment, by the time of the 1800s and then into the 1900s, Aleinu was already being recast for many people that no longer saw their neighbors as being idol worshippers or as being those that would serve the temporal powers that merely wore the trappings of religion. They saw their neighbors as also repulsed by such ideas, and they saw our mission not to sweep them aside, but to find a way to embrace all of us together under the same light. That's good. That's healthy. That is one of the joys of Judaism, to be able to look at the same words that have given us inspiration for 2,000, 3,000 years in some case, and to find new inspiration for our current situation. That is what it means for Judaism to be a living, breathing faith. And it's what it means for us to have to engage with the faith. It means we actually have to read the words. One of my great fears is that so often we will recite passages mechanically, by rote, thinking of them as simply being, dare I say, and copy myself from this morning, incantations that must merely be repeated verbatim with no thought to what they mean, what they could mean, and what they have meant. We need to make sure that our tefillah is constantly alive within us. We need to make sure that it still reflects our needs, our dreams, and we still must reflect its needs and its dreams. This conversation through the text of the Siddur and Machzor and the High Holidays is part of what has made Judaism unbounded by time. We straddle the worlds by being able to look at the same words and say, yes, I see what you needed it to say, but I need to look at it a little differently. That only works if you actually take the time to read the words, make them yours, and find what they need to say to you. Now, Shabbat Shalom and Shana Tova.